Thank you so very much. I am Isabel Wilkerson, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. I am the daughter of survivors of Jim Crow. I am a daughter of the Great Migration. My parents grew up under formal segregation in the racial caste system of the American South. And my ancestors before them were either born into Jim Crow or into enslavement. I am the direct descendant of the history and legacy of both suffering and strength, of trauma and transcendence. I was raised directly by people who defected the Jim Crow South to pursue their dreams in the North during the Great Migration, only to find themselves further suppressed by redlining and restrictive covenants and de facto segregation in the place of refuge. I am testifying because not enough Americans know the true and full history of our country or the origins of the divisions that we now face, and thus of the karmic, social, and economic indebtedness to African Americans that the country has inherited. I believe that knowing our country's history is the first step toward overcoming the challenges we face as a nation. It was my honor and privilege to be tutored in the lived experience of what African Americans endured in the 20th century when I interviewed and talked with more than 1,200 people across the country who participated in the Great Migration, including hundreds that I spoke to who migrated to California. The Great Migration was the mass relocation of 6 million African Americans from the Jim Crow South to the cities of the North and West from World War I until the 1970s. It was the only time in American history that American citizens had to flee the land of their birth just to be recognized as the citizens that they had always been. No other group of Americans has had to act like immigrants in order to be recognized as citizens. This migration, like other migrations in human history, was not about geography. It was about freedom and how far people are willing to go to achieve it. It is a measure of the repression that they were facing in the South, that they were willing to journey across the country farther than some current day immigrants in search of freedom, in search of the freedom that was denied them in the region of their birth. This was a seeking of political asylum within the borders of one's own country. They were fleeing a caste system known as Jim Crow. It was an artificial hierarchy in which everything that you could and could not do was based upon what you looked like, your perceived identity, and your assigned location within that hierarchy. This caste system was so arcane and repressive that it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. You could go to jail if you were caught playing checkers with a person of a different race. This caste system was so tightly devised that in courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. The very word of God was segregated in the caste system of the Jim Crow South. This was the concept of purity versus pollution that is a hallmark of caste and which extended into every sphere of life. The majority of Black people who have ever lived in this country were excluded from the body politic, excluded from the economy that depended upon them, consigned to the lowliest and most dangerous work, consigned to hard labor or servitude, and openly underpaid in the 20th century, if paid at all, especially under the institution of sharecropping. This artificial hierarchy required a tremendous amount of violence to sustain, such that every 4 days an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of the protocols of caste in the first 4 decades of the 20th century. As Black Southerners made their way out of that world, they followed 3 beautifully predictable streams, as in any migration throughout human history. The East Coast stream carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and on up the East Coast. The Midwest stream carried people from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and the entire Midwest. And then there was the West Coast stream, which carried people from Louisiana and Texas out to California and the entire West Coast. It was a redistribution of an entire people. Before the Great Migration began, 90% of all African Americans were living in, nearly held captive in the South. By the time the Great Migration was over in the 1970s, nearly half of all African Americans were living outside of the South. This was the first time in American history that the lowest caste people signaled en masse that they had options and were willing to take them. That had not happened in the 3 centuries that African Americans had been on the soil by that time. It had not happened in the 12 generations of enslavement that preceded nearly a century of Jim Crow. How many greats do you have to add to the word grandparent to begin to conceive of how long enslavement lasted in the United States? Let me put enslavement in perspective. Enslavement was the systematic dehumanization of an entire people, the conversion of human beings into commodities, the holding hostage of an entire people for the enrichment of others and of the country, enforced with a level of brutality that many Americans have not had a chance to learn of, a level of enforcement that would have been in violation of the Geneva Convention had it applied to African Americans. Slavery lasted for so long, and again, this is the precursor of the world in which we live today, a precursor of Jim Crow, and a precursor of many of the divisions we live with. Slavery lasted for so long that it will not be until next year, 2022, that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. No adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as African Americans were enslaved. That will not happen until the year 2111. It will not be until the year 2111 that African Americans will reach parity between slavery and freedom. We need to remember that the earliest waves of Black Southerners to arrive in the North and West were recruited to the North and West to fill labor shortages in the steel mills, factories, and shipyards. But it turned out that the North wanted the labor, but did not want the people. How exactly do you do that? The response to the Great Migration in these receiving stations of the North and West was to build structural barriers of exclusion, of restrictive covenants, which forbade even those white people who might have wanted to sell to Black people from doing so. The response to the Great Migration was to institute redlining and mortgage lending, which denied federally backed mortgages in any neighborhood in which Black people lived, thus excluding by law and by policy the parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents of most every African American alive today from the greatest source of family wealth in this country, from home ownership, from the American dream itself. It is this exclusion from the generational wealth that arises from home ownership that accounts in large part for the racial wealth gap in which white people whose ancestors were the beneficiaries of these exclusionary policies have 10 times the wealth of Black Americans, a wealth gap that one study showed would take, at the current rate, 228 years to close. 228 years. Thus, the caste system followed the migrants wherever they went and became not merely a Southern phenomenon, but a national one. As in other states and cities, even after restrictive covenants were struck down as unconstitutional at mid-century, white residents of Los Angeles resisted Black incursions into the strongholds of Glendale, Canoga Park, Hawthorne, and most of San Fernando Valley. There, in the valley suburb of Pacoima, a World War II veteran, Emory Hestus Holmes, moved his family into a 3-bedroom home in 1959 and faced a relentless campaign to force them out. The white neighbors, according to the historian Josh Sides and news reports, bombarded them with phone calls in the middle of the night, harassed them with nonstop visits from random delivery services that they hadn't asked for, repairmen and exterminators they hadn't called, and taxis that they had not ordered. They threw rocks into their windows, left tacks in their driveway, sent a hearse to pick up, quote unquote, the deceased. They burned a cross on their lawn and spray painted their garage with the words, "Black cancer lives here. Don't let this spread." This was in 1959, within the lifespan of millions of people alive today. The Holmeses stayed. Holmes sued the neighbors and went on to become a housing rights activist and a founder of the San Fernando Valley Fair Housing Council. He had fled Jim Crow only to have to fight James Crow in California. The Great Migration was the first time in American history that the lowest caste people, such as Holmes, actually had the chance to choose for themselves what they would do with their God-given talents and where they would pursue them. Think about those cotton fields and those rice plantations and those sugar plantations and those tobacco fields. On those sugar plantations and tobacco fields and rice plantations and cotton fields were opera singers, jazz musicians, playwrights, novelists, surgeons, attorneys, professors, accountants, legislators. And how do we know that? We know that because that is what they and their children and their grandchildren and now great-grandchildren have often chosen to become once they had the chance to choose for themselves what they would do with their God-given talents. The majority of African Americans in the North, the Midwest, and the West are descendants of the Great Migration, but the people who made the migration did not often talk about the traumas of Jim Crow. It is a measure of all that they suffered that they very rarely spoke of the world that they had escaped. When they left for good. They did not look back. It was too painful to do so. They didn't want to burden their children with what they had endured, the repression, the dehumanization, the dangers that they had lived under. When people seek to deny the harm suffered by African Americans at the hands of the state, they often dismiss slavery as a long ago grievance, when in fact, not only do we currently live with the unaddressed history of slavery, we do not have to go back to slavery to document the exclusion, inequities, and brutalities African Americans have endured. Much of the harm and exclusion of African Americans happened within the lifespan of people alive today. The story of African Americans has been an ongoing fight for recognition of one's humanity and citizenship, a constant pressing against the wind to rise above the station to which African Americans have been confined, meaning the bottom of the caste system that they did not create, did not wish to be a part of, and have sought to escape from the very beginning. I believe reparations are a natural and necessary part of the country's reckoning with its history, of coming to terms with the consequences of a history that still plagues us as a nation, and which has frayed the social fabric and harms every single citizen, whether they realize it or not. Whenever people talk to me about their response to my work, they usually say, I had no idea. I had no idea that this happened in our country. I had no idea that this happened in the region in which I lived. I had no idea that this happened so recently. I had no idea. Not having an idea has consequences. It affects how people vote, where they choose to live, whom they choose to hire or to grant a mortgage, where they send their children to school, where they and the country invest its resources or withhold its resources. I believe that we need a massive education effort and an honest and robust truth and reconciliation commitment to lay bare the true history of this country so that every citizen can know the ways in which the state has systematically favored some groups and excluded others, and why reparations are a long overdue part of any serious effort to heal our country, to atone for the past and for current injustices, and to rectify continuing disparities. I believe that if the majority of Americans knew the true, full history of what was sacrificed to create this country, they would be calling for reparations themselves. Thank you so much for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.